It was supposed to be a show of unity, a carefully orchestrated public event to demonstrate strength and shared purpose. But when Camilla extended her hand with a poised smile, two of the firm's most respected women, Princess Anne and Princess Catherine, did the unthinkable. In front of cameras, in front of witnesses, in front of history. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The Royal Foundation event had been billed as a hallmark of reconciliation, one that would put an end to months of swirling headlines and speculative silence. Behind closed doors, aides had labored for weeks to ensure that optics were flawless, that any lingering tensions would be drowned out by the grandeur of shared purpose. The public, fed on months of rumor and strategic distancing between senior royals, were ready to believe in a facade of collaboration. But no amount of choreography could conceal the truth that would unfold within moments of the key arrivals. As Princess Anne's car pulled up, followed shortly by Catherine's, anticipation electrified the air. Camilla was already positioned, smile fixed, hand extended like a flag of truce. The cameras zoomed, the world watched, and then nothing. No handshake, no eye contact, no warmth. What followed was more than a simple missed greeting, it was a statement, carved in ice. Princess Anne, stoic and sharp, offered only the barest of nods. Catherine, composed yet unmistakably distant, bypassed the gesture entirely, exchanging pleasantries only with the event hosts. The air thickened, tension radiated like a silent explosion. For royal watchers accustomed to formality masking dysfunction, this was a crack in the marble, a rare glimpse into the fracture lines beneath the institution's polished veneer. Attendees exchanged confused glances, journalists began frantically scribbling, and palace aides, realizing the gravity of what had just transpired, immediately activated crisis containment. By the time the event concluded, the headlines were already flooding the digital front lines. Royal icy silence shocks Britain, Camilla snubbed in public by senior royals, and united front crumbles before our eyes. It wasn't just a gesture gone wrong, it was an unraveling. Behind the scenes, aides scrambled to reshape the narrative, offering pre-packaged lines about miscommunication and unfortunate timing. But no one was buying it. Not the public, not the press, and certainly not those who knew the history. Because this wasn't a spontaneous snub, it was a reckoning years in the making, rooted in whispered betrayals and buried power plays that few outside the palace dared to imagine. Behind the forced smiles and polished waves lies a story of clashing values, generational divides, and quiet resentment. While the public adored the image of royal unity, insiders knew that Catherine and Anne's loyalty to the late Queen came with boundaries Camilla had long crossed. To the untrained eye, the royal family has always appeared as a tightly choreographed symphony, every nod, every smile, every wave timed and rehearsed to perfection. But behind the velvet curtains and carefully chosen public moments, there has always been a current of silent resistance, a resistance rooted not in ambition, but in legacy. Princess Anne, known for her no-nonsense approach and unwavering devotion to her mother's principles, never warmed to the idea of Camilla as queen. Her mistrust wasn't born from petty jealousy or outdated sentiment. It was forged in the years when Camilla's presence loomed like a shadow during the unraveling of Charles's first marriage. Anne saw firsthand the private toll it took on the late Princess Diana, and perhaps more importantly, on the crown itself. For Anne, duty was sacred, and history was not so easily erased by coronation robes and designer brooches. Catherine, on the other hand, arrived in the royal fold decades later, but her sensibilities echoed Anne's in eerie parallel. Raised outside the aristocracy but schooled in quiet strength, Catherine aligned herself with Queen Elizabeth's values from the beginning: grace, restraint, and an unflinching sense of service. It wasn't just admiration, it was devotion. And with that devotion came an almost instinctive wariness toward anything that threatened the integrity of what the late Queen had built. Camilla, though officially accepted into the institution, represented a shift, a break from tradition, wrapped in the language of modernity. To Catherine and Anne, this wasn't evolution, it was erosion. As Camilla's influence surged in recent years, first as a supportive consort, then as queen, those cracks between generations widened. Her growing visibility, frequent presence in state engagements, and soft power in court decisions were not overlooked. What the public saw as harmonious collaboration was, in truth, a delicate dance of competing ideals. While newspapers celebrated Camilla's refreshing candor and approachable style, those closer to the throne understood the subtext. There was discomfort brewing behind the scenes. Whispered objections, hesitations over titles. Decisions that once would have been filtered through the lens of Elizabethan discipline were now being shaped by Camilla's circle. And for Anne and Catherine, that shift was difficult to stomach. In subtle but telling moments, their unease began to seep into public engagements, glances withheld, awkward positioning during group photos, hesitation in praise during speeches. To the trained eye, these weren't accidental. These were the signals of seasoned royal women drawing lines in sand that had already been trampled. It was less rebellion and more resistance, a shared, unspoken understanding between Anne and Catherine that their role wasn't just to smile and adapt, but to protect what was left of a legacy built over 70 years. Because at its core, their bond was forged in grief and loyalty to a monarch who valued humility over spectacle, duty over drama. And in Camilla's ascendance, they saw a rewriting of that story. Not through scandal or aggression, but through quiet influence and redefined norms. That, to them, was far more dangerous. The public applauded a united front, but within the palace walls, a silent current of dissent stirred between the traditionalists and the newly emboldened inner circle. But it wasn't just history haunting the royal foundation. New developments behind palace walls had reignited old wounds and forced Anne and Catherine to take a silent stand. For months, insiders had whispered about Camilla's increasingly tight grip on royal decision-making, a quiet reorganization of patronages, sudden reassignments, and unreturned calls. And when Anne and Catherine were both left out of a pivotal planning committee, the message was clear: Camilla was drawing lines. It began with what appeared to be routine adjustments, small changes in how projects were prioritized, which charities received attention, and who was included in key advisory meetings. But beneath those surface-level tweaks, there was a growing unease among senior courtiers. Camilla, once seen as a supportive consort quietly adapting to her role, had begun constructing something far more formidable, an unofficial circle of influence. While it carried no formal title, everyone knew what it was. A cadre of trusted aides, loyal to her and her alone, who began shaping schedules, nudging protocol, and deciding whose legacy would be elevated and whose would be left behind. And when the new schedule for the upcoming royal year was released, it became painfully obvious that the balance of power had shifted. Anne's calendar, long filled with engagements steeped in history and heavy with symbolic continuity, had been quietly trimmed. Catherine's initiatives, many of them deeply rooted in child development, mental health, and education, were suddenly being overshadowed by newer projects launched under Camilla's name. Patronages that had once been pillars of Queen Elizabeth's reign were reassigned or shelved entirely, without so much as a formal discussion. Meetings that traditionally required input from senior female royals now carried no invitation. When Catherine questioned it, she was met with vague assurances. When Anne demanded an explanation, she was told it was a matter of strategic streamlining. But behind those words was something far more insidious, a deliberate redirection of influence, where tradition and legacy were no longer the guiding stars. Even within the palace staff, the shift in loyalty was unmistakable. Positions that once answered directly to Clarence House were now funneled through Camilla's network. Long-serving aides who had built careers under Queen Elizabeth's quiet command found themselves increasingly irrelevant. Some chose to leave. Others stayed silent, fearing reprisal or replacement. But Anne did not stay silent. In a rare and pointed comment, she warned of an institutional rewriting, taking place an erosion of legacy cloaked in the language of modernization. Catherine, though more reserved in public, felt the sting just as sharply. Her projects received less press, fewer resources, and in some cases were quietly rescheduled to make room for newer, more press-friendly initiatives. The frustration grew, not just for what was happening, but for how invisibly it was being executed, death by 1,000 courtesies. To the public, nothing seemed amiss. Royal appearances continued. Smiles remained fixed. But behind the scenes, a storm was gathering. Anne's decades of service were being treated like footnotes. Catherine's vision for a modern, compassionate monarchy was being dimmed, and Camilla, shielded by her growing proximity to the king, moved freely, her authority rarely questioned. The exclusion from the planning committee was more than a scheduling oversight, it was a statement of intent. And for Anne and Catherine, it was the final signal that the game had changed. No longer were they respected protectors of the Queen's legacy. They were obstacles to a new order being written in real time. As the power struggle simmered, a single confrontation behind closed doors pushed Catherine to a personal breaking point and turned Anne into her fiercest ally. It was meant to be a private retreat. But in the drawing room of Balmoral Castle, what began as a tense conversation between royals turned into a storm of raised voices and slammed doors. And at the centre of it all, Camilla, Catherine, and the fate of the monarchy's future. The gathering at Balmoral had been framed as a moment of calm, a pause from the chaos of headlines, a chance for reflection, for unity. But for those inside the castle walls, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. What was supposed to be a quiet conversation about upcoming engagements swiftly turned into a confrontation charged with years of unspoken tensions. Camilla, surrounded by a growing web of influence and emboldened by her role, had allegedly questioned the frequency and necessity of Catherine's public appearances, a comment made behind closed doors but delivered with the sting of calculated dismissal. She spoke of optics, modernity, and the evolving role of the monarchy, but to Catherine, the message was devastatingly clear. She was being sidelined. What followed was not a calm exchange, it was an eruption. For someone like Catherine, who had spent years navigating royal duty with poise and restraint, being reduced to tears was rare, and it did not go unnoticed. Anne, hearing the muffled voices and sensing the shift in energy, entered the room not as a spectator, but as a defender. What she walked into was a scene of emotional unraveling. Catherine, visibly shaken. Camilla, firm in tone but dismissive in posture. Anne, who had once weathered her own storms within these walls, was not about to let another legacy be dismantled in silence. She challenged Camilla directly, questioning not just her tone, but her intentions. She brought up the Queen. The legacy. The expectation that those who inherit a crown also inherit the responsibility to preserve what came before. The words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. William, caught between the woman he married and the stepmother he was expected to respect, struggled to intervene. His attempt at diplomacy only deepened the divide. Every word he offered was met with tension. As Catherine remained silent, her composure fractured, her voice gone. And in the midst of it all, King Charles stood by, absorbing the unraveling of his family without a single word. He left the room quietly, unwilling or unable to stop what was unfolding. The doors closed behind him with the weight of generational burden. No apology came, no reconciliation followed. The family dispersed, each carrying their own version of the truth, but only some of them burdened by consequence. Camilla walked away with her authority intact, her circle emboldened. Catherine left with a new kind of resolve, carved from pain. And Anne, unapologetically fierce, made it clear that the line had been crossed, and she would not forget it. What happened in Balmoral could not be undone. It would linger in every future gathering, every speech, every joint appearance. The illusion of unity had shattered in the place once deemed the monarch's sanctuary. When the royals returned to public life, the wounds remained fresh, and one highly visible event would become the battleground for silent resistance. Royal watchers dissect every glance, every gesture. But at the Royal Foundation event, body language wasn't subtle, it was thunderous. Was this a lapse in protocol or a carefully calculated message of defiance? Within hours of the footage emerging, experts from every corner of the media landscape began their dissection. not just of what was said, but what wasn't. The footage showed what no statement could deny. Camilla, poised with an extended hand, was met not with warmth, but with indifference. Catherine, calm but cool, offered no smile, no nod, no acknowledgement. Anne, known for her famously sharp instincts and seasoned composure, mirrored the same restraint. Their movements were neither rushed nor flustered, they were deliberate. And that, according to body language specialists, was the tell. This wasn't a misstep born of distraction. It was a message delivered not with words, but with precision. The silence between them rang louder than any confrontation could. Catherine's eyes never met Camilla's. Anne's posture remained rigid, her glance quick but dismissive. The absence of traditional greeting cues, no touch, no lean-in, no shared warmth, stood out against the royal standard of polished interactions. Camilla, caught in that split second of unexpected rejection, froze. Her smile faltered, her hand wavered just slightly before she turned, retreating into the rhythm of the event. But the damage had been done. Around them, aides shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting, earpieces active. The rehearsed calm gave way to quiet chaos as palace staff scrambled to recalibrate the optics. Behind the scenes, handlers issued new photo angles. Flashes were redirected. Narratives were being rewritten before the event had even ended. But the public had already seen it and heard it. Microphones caught a ripple of murmurs from the crowd, low, stunned voices questioning what had just unfolded in front of them. The brief moment of icy tension had broken the illusion of unity. What was once reserved for tabloid speculation had spilled into the open, playing out in real time. The firm's image, curated over decades, had just cracked on stage. The press circled like hawks, headlines sharpened and ready. Royal chill stuns nation, read one. Snubbed and seen, declared another. But underneath the clickbait surface, there was a deeper undercurrent, something darker. For if the most senior women in the monarchy could not hide their discontent, what did it say about the fractures no one could see? The analysts agreed on one thing: this was not accidental. Not from Anne. Not from Catherine. The Royal Foundation was meant to symbolize collaboration, shared duty, and united leadership. Instead, it became a battleground for silent protest, a single moment that echoed years of suppressed tension. A protest dressed in decorum, but steeped in disappointment. And as the footage replayed endlessly across media platforms, the message reached further than the palace had feared. While media outlets debated the moment, inside the palace, Camilla's allies pushed for consequences, but Anne and Catherine were no longer willing to be silent. Within 24 hours, headlines across the globe were ablaze. Royal rift deepens. Frost at the foundation. But for the first time, the press wasn't on Camilla's side, and it wasn't by accident. Whispers that had once been confined to marble corridors and closed-door meetings now thundered through every media outlet in Britain and beyond. But this time, the narrative wasn't being shaped by palace press officers. It was being carefully, deliberately directed by those tired of silence. Selective leaks dripping with tension and truth began to surface, painting a picture the public hadn't seen before. Anonymous sources close to senior royals revealed what many had long suspected, that Camilla's rise wasn't just ceremonial, it was strategic. Reports described a queen consort who had gradually centralized influence, rewired access, and undermined decades of legacy in the name of efficiency. But the term most frequently echoed in those leaks: controlling, a word that cut through the gilded presentation and landed like a blow. The stories weren't wild fabrications. They were precise, carefully worded, and unmistakably sympathetic toward Catherine and Anne. Headlines subtly reframed the snub at the Royal Foundation not as a scandal, but as an act of quiet resistance. Catherine, the dignified figure caught in a maelstrom of power plays, was portrayed as gracious under pressure, a royal wife wronged, but never retaliatory. Meanwhile, Anne's role was amplified with admiration. "The Queen's daughter defends the crown," read one editorial, praising her unwavering loyalty to Elizabeth's legacy and her refusal to be sidelined by internal politics. The tone had shifted, and with it, public sentiment. In television debates and radio call-ins, voices rose in support of the women who had once been expected to bow and adapt. Social media buzzed with hashtags like number I stand with Catherine and number Princess Anne knows. Online polls showed Camilla's favourability plummeting by the day. Commentators who had once lauded her transformation from scandal to stability now questioned whether her ambition had finally gone too far. And for the first time in years, Clarence House found itself on the defensive. Camilla's press team scrambled, issuing statements meant to reaffirm unity, pushing out recycled images of smiling royals at past events. But the damage was already done. The silence of Anne and Catherine had spoken louder than 1,000 press releases, and the palace's usual grip on narrative control had slipped through its fingers. Because this wasn't just a story of protocol or personality, it was a story of trust. The public had long memories. They remembered Diana's tears. They remembered Elizabeth's grace. And now, they were watching closely as history threatened to repeat itself, not with scandal in tabloids, but with betrayal under chandeliers. Every insider quote, every strategic leak, every sympathetic column was a battle in a larger war being fought through perception. A war Camilla could no longer win with charm alone. The court of public opinion had turned, and what began as a single cold gesture had now become a defining fracture, one that questioned not only Camilla's conduct, but the future of the monarchy itself. The tension wasn't just media fodder, it was triggering real consequences behind palace gates, where loyalty was being tested and alliances redrawn. King Charles said nothing. Not publicly. Not even privately to those who needed him most. But Prince William had reached his limit. Behind palace walls, he delivered a chilling ultimatum that sent shockwaves through the monarchy. The storm outside the palace gates had grown too loud to ignore, but within the gilded halls, Charles remained disturbingly silent. His advisors urged him to release a statement, to stage a photo opportunity, to acknowledge the growing divide within the family, but he declined. Time, he believed, would settle the matter. Dignified silence was the weapon of kings. But William no longer had the luxury of patience. He had watched his wife endure weeks of thinly veiled criticism. Her work diminished, her composure stretched thin, and now her dignity questioned before the world. The toll on Catherine had become unbearable, and William knew that if he did not act now, the damage would not only become irreversible, it would be unforgivable. The meeting was quiet, unannounced. Just 3 people: William, Charles, and Camilla. There were no aides, no notes taken. But what was said behind those doors altered the royal landscape forever. William did not yell. He did not posture, but what he delivered was more piercing than rage. He spoke of the toll on his wife, on his children, on the legacy of the crown. He reminded them of the promises made after Queen Elizabeth's passing, the vow to protect unity, to safeguard duty. He said Catherine's strength had limits, and they were now in full view of the world. Then came the ultimatum. If the undercutting, the dismissals, the silent sabotage continued, he would step back. From appearances, from engagements, from royal life, if it came to that. His loyalty was to his wife and to the integrity of the institution, not to the palace machinery that had turned a blind eye to betrayal. Camilla responded, but not with apology. She defended her position, her efforts, her version of the story. She spoke of press manipulation, of being unfairly vilified. But her words fell flat. William wasn't asking for justification, he was demanding accountability. And just as the tension reached its peak, another voice entered the fray, not in that room, but through quiet counsel in the days that followed. Anne. Unshakable, pragmatic, and fiercely loyal to the monarchy's foundation, she made her stance known without spectacle. She supported William, perhaps not in method, but in principle. Her message was clear. Enough had been risked. And the longer Charles failed to act, the more the crown itself was dragged into disrepute. Charles was shaken. Not just as a monarch, but as a father and husband caught in the eye of a very public storm. He knew the implications of William stepping back. The line of succession would fracture before the nation's eyes. The monarchy's most visible hope for continuity would dim. And yet, he remained frozen, unable to find the balance between duty and emotion, between a wife who had stood by him through scandal and a son now threatening to walk away because of her. But even as Charles wavered, Camilla wasn't ready to back down, and she made one final move that would decide the fate of the family's public image. Camilla had been preparing a major speech, her most personal yet intended to redefine her role and legacy. But in the wake of mounting backlash, it was pulled at the last minute. The silence said more than any words could. For weeks, preparations had been underway. The speech was meant to be a bold recalibration, a declaration of purpose from the Queen Consort herself. Camilla, determined to reclaim her narrative, had envisioned this address as a turning point. A chance to reintroduce herself not just as a partner to the monarch, but as a woman of empathy, of leadership, of modern sensibilities. It was to be delivered at a charity gala, with cameras rolling and press lined up, her voice rising above the noise that had recently engulfed her. But behind palace doors, concern was brewing. Senior advisors, once enthusiastic about the idea, grew wary. The tone, they feared, would sound tone-deaf in the current climate, the timing disastrous. The royal foundation fallout was still too raw. Catherine's quiet dignity, Anne's steely silence, and William's private warning had left the public with a clear perception, and it wasn't one Camilla could rewrite with a carefully crafted speech. Palace aides, reading the temperature of the nation and the headlines still pulsing with tension, urged a reconsideration. It wasn't just about the words. It was about what they would imply that Camilla saw herself as the victim, that she was still trying to ascend while the monarchy itself was caught in a whirlwind of internal division. Late the night before the event, the decision was made. Quietly, strategically, the speech was shelved. No public announcement, no explanation, just absence. And in that silence, speculation exploded. Media outlets noted the cancellation. Columnists questioned whether the Queen Consort had lost her grip on the royal narrative. Was it a retreat or a recalibration? Whatever the intent, the optics were damning. Days later, Catherine and Anne appeared together, united, composed, powerful. It wasn't what they said, but how they stood, shoulder to shoulder, carrying the quiet weight of the Queen's legacy without fanfare, without spin. Their presence was a statement, a contrast, a reminder of what royal strength once looked like and still could. Meanwhile, Camilla's absence from the next 3 major public engagements did not go unnoticed. Whispers of health concerns were dismissed. Insiders confirmed it was intentional, a step back to avoid further inflaming a fragile public mood. But even without her presence, the shift was palpable. The center of gravity within the monarchy had moved, not loudly, not officially, but undeniably. And yet, what remained wasn't defeat, it was a shift, a rebalancing, a quiet, unmistakable change in the monarchy's internal power map. No declarations, no resignations. But behind the silence, the message was loud. Anne and Catherine had drawn a line, and the monarchy, for better or worse, had heard them. What unfolded in the weeks that followed was not marked by dramatic confrontation, but by a quiet recalibration, one more potent than any speech or press release. Catherine and Anne, though never once naming their stance, emerged not as rebels, but as guardians of a legacy. Their silence was not submission. It was a strategic, regal defiance that reminded the world of what the crown had once stood for: dignity, resilience, and purpose. They had not challenged the monarchy, they had protected it. In the absence of chaos, their actions echoed louder than the headlines that came before. Public perception shifted, not out of sympathy, but out of recognition. These 2 women had carried the weight of continuity on their shoulders, not with rage, but with resolve. And now, the nation was watching them not as figureheads, but as pillars. Camilla, once steadily rising in visibility and confidence, took a step back. Not forced, but necessary. The palace narrative shifted subtly, but unmistakably. Fewer solo appearances. No personal essays, no feature interviews. Her voice, for now, had receded. The once celebrated image of a modern queen giving shape to a new era was replaced by something quieter, something cautious. And while no statement was ever made, it was clear. The foundation had trembled, and the queen consort had felt the aftershock. Her influence, while not erased, had been tempered by public will and private consequence. What remained was a monarchy realigning itself, not around individual ambition, but around the principles that had held it together for generations. In the background, William's role began to evolve. No longer just the heir, he became a silent mediator, calm, composed, but unshakable in his loyalty to Catherine. His presence in family meetings, in strategic planning, in ceremonial duties, became more consistent, more commanding. Without fanfare, he reminded those inside the palace walls that the future of the monarchy would not be built on whispered rivalries or forced smiles, it would be built on integrity. And as he stood beside his wife during engagements, the nation took notice. Approval ratings surged. Editorials praised not just Catherine's elegance, but her substance. She had weathered the storm without compromising her values, and in doing so, redefined what it meant to be the Princess of Wales. Public engagements slowly began to reflect this new energy. Themes of unity, inclusion, and remembrance became central. Causes once sidelined were brought back into the spotlight. Anne doubled down on her long-standing commitments, her calendar more active than ever, her speeches sharp and measured. Catherine focused on healing both publicly, and it was whispered privately. And with each appearance, each deliberate step forward, the royal family reminded the world that though fractured, it was not broken. The crown had absorbed the tension, the backlash, the scrutiny, and emerged not diminished, but altered, wiser. And as history writes the next chapter, one truth remains undeniable. Sometimes the most powerful statements are made without saying a word. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.